You're listening to The Audit presented by IT Audit Labs. My name is Joshua Schmidt, your co-host and producer. Today we're joined by Eric Brown and Nick Mellum of IT Audit Labs, and our guest today is Foster Davis of BreachBits. Thanks so much for joining us today, Foster. How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So we'd like to hear a little bit of background from you and your experience. You're a naval officer as well as a tech entrepreneur.
That's right. Well, at least in my former life, recently left the reserve, but before I did, served for about 15 years, active duty, U.S. Navy, cyber warfare, cryptologic officer, as they were calling it, as I left, and spent about half the time in the service fighting pirates on the high seas, and the second half working spooky missions in dark buildings and red teaming, of course.
Awesome. So we've seen these traditional red team engagements. They cost a fortune. And you kind of mentioned that a lot of the times they become outdated within weeks.
I think from our end, it's really important that you have an outside look on your security posture and what you're doing. There's, I think, two reasons for that. One is technical, because those things need to be looked at. As we used to say in the Navy, inspect what you expect. The second reason, though, is it's psychological. You know, there's this blindness that you get from looking at your own situation, and that could be, of course, we're talking about security, but that could be everywhere in life. You know, sometimes you've ever had that your best friend is the one that will tell you you've got, some mustard on your face or something like that. So that has just always fascinated me from the first time I ever did red teaming. So there's the part about red teaming itself and that it should be done at some point. And then there's the magic of what if we could do this process continuously or near continuously, and why would that even matter? And I would say that's because attackers are sure coming after you all the time. And so why do something once a year when the other 365, the attackers are? So that's kind of how we approach it.
That outside in perspective really brings to light a lot of the things that the internal teams already know and say. But then when you have that essentially certification from an outside resource who says the same thing, packages it up and puts it into a format that's digestible, it seems to be better accepted and listened to by the people that make decisions in the organization. And we see that too coming in as consultants. We could be saying the exact same thing that the internal team has. And when we've gone in to do these engagements in the past, the internal team who's usually partnered with us to do the engagement will just tell us like all of the areas that they have been trying to get attention on, local admin or whatever it is, so that they can make sure that those things appear in the report as well.
What is it inherent about these red team engagements that make them go obsolete so quickly? And then what have you, both Eric and Foster, have you seen to remediate that timeliness of those assessments?
I think what we've seen is that the speed with which attackers develop, it could be new tactics or it could just be variations on tactics that are well tried and true. But sort of, I'd say the life cycle of the attacker's reattack or their next try. Couple that with the fact that IT infrastructures, attack surfaces are always changing, and there's a challenge to keep up with that. I mean, put those two together, and now you have a situation where if you aren't looking often, it's almost like you're not looking at all.
Yeah, and Nick, you and I have been faced with this recently here in the local environment related to the breach that's going on in the Minnesota and in particular the St. Paul area, where there was an encryption event that occurred, and the localities around here are just scrambling to get their cyber. Really to have a focus on that, because it wasn't just one breach, but it was a few different breaches at a couple of different municipalities. And it shines the light on the fact that point in time hygiene is really not what works. It has to be that continual investment in people, place, or technology and process, because you can't just say, hey, we're going to spend $1 million this year, and then we're going to forget about it for 5 years, which unfortunately is what we see all too often. So you do need that continual reminder. And Nick, you've been living in this for a while.
Every day.
Or what are you seeing?
Well, yeah, and kind of, I guess, around this whole topic is, I think when you use that, I figure it's kind of like chasing your tail, right? Everybody, they're chasing the tail, they're doing the same thing, and they're doing sometimes either for compliance reasons because they own a set of data, maybe CGIS or PCI, whatever it is, and they're doing it just enough to meet those compliance needs. But to Foster's point, they're doing it once every year or whatever it is. And those are the 364. They're not doing anything, and then that loop comes back around. They're chasing their tail, and then that's when that breach happens. And this is what we're seeing at St. Paul. We're not necessarily hands-on with St. Paul right now, but we've gone into that defensive posture at one of the accounts to make sure that there's no issues. So we're well defended, but we're seeing maybe at St. Paul that things could have been done differently. And I think that's probably the case for most anybody that goes through a breach. Hindsight's 2020. They could have done some things different.
So Foster, I'm curious if you could give us your take on what a red team engagement looks like.
Certainly. I like to start by thinking as to why we even call it red teaming. I've heard different stories around this, but one that I like is it's sort of like if you are on the football team and you're preparing for the championship, what are you going to do? You're going to throw half the players a red pennant jersey. They're going to play the other team, and they're maybe even run some of the plays that the other team is known for running to see if your team, how well you're going to do against it. And even just making a statement like that, or this, I kind of brought up earlier about, I see it as two halves. There's the technical part of it, but then there's the psychology. And so where I would say is start with a psychology of what are we here to do? The psychology here is that there's a team of people who are inside, who are working very hard every day to accomplish a mission. And what we need to do is we need to have a group of people that are outside of that, who will pretend to be bad guys, nefarious, call it what you want. And once you can, if you start the engagement by just saying we're going to have two separate teams, if you just even start with that, and then later you can have different levels of technical ability and things like that, but start by keeping it a bit separate. And so what you're going to do with red teaming is you're going to have this separate team who's going to think different. They're not going to communicate or trade information with the blue team, as we would say, the good guys, the internal guys. And we're going to have them be separate and essentially plan, spy versus spy or a chess match, whatever you want to think about it, and start to plan how you're going to achieve an attack on an organization. And even then right there, even if just you did it on paper, the goals of the organization might be X, Y, and Z. The posture and protections of that organization may also be here. But already that red team is thinking in ways about how to skirt around or how to approach that organization to get what they want. Because what the attackers want isn't always what the defenders think they want. So in setting up this framing, you allow this red team to go through that independent thought of what needs to be done. And then, and so then when you start an engagement or you start the scrimmage, start the clock, you allow each team to put up their best effort. And then periodically what you're going to do is take a break. Each team will talk about the things that they noticed, and they tell them from their perspective. And it's one of those engagements where there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. It just is. It's just what was observed. And if both teams can equally, mutually respect what each other team is seeing, what each team is seeing is absolutely correct, and that's what they observe. And then if you put some programming around it such that you're led through a discussion to understand that what somebody saw is what they saw, but we can also reconcile what is actually correct. And then for the blue team, and did that particular issue even matter towards the mission of the company? So some of those things all put together. And then, of course, a lot of the red team guys are going to be technical experts. They're going to be, maybe they've done some hacking in the past, maybe they've done penetration testing. And so that, if you do all that together in a very deliberate way, now you are sort of evolving past what I might call a discrete penetration test into this red teaming methodology, this mentality that what the hacker believes could be true is very, very important to know as you're trying to defend that.
Yeah, I certainly agree too. And I think a lot of the ways we're thinking about this at IT Audit Labs is shifting focus to the not reactionary, but we're playing the offensive game. We're not waiting for a breach to happen. We're training as if it did happen and getting people to shift into that mindset of not just playing defense and reactionary. And I think we just see that across the board. People just live in that space of waiting for something to happen. They do what they do. I don't know if I necessarily want to say the bare minimum, but they're getting by, right? It hasn't happened yet, or it hasn't been reported yet, at least, that something's happening. But I think a lot of it is a culture shift, to get people to think about these things, how it could happen, where their weak points might be, and to continue to put these efforts forward to find those issues before they become a problem.
Nick, we're experiencing it right now, right? Where never waste a good breach, and that's kind of like the internal messaging to take advantage of for the IT and cyber teams to get the funding or to bring on the resources that they need to accomplish the items they've identified as areas to improve in the organization. But it's unfortunate that it comes down to that, right? You look at St. Paul as an excellent case study. This thing is taking them offline for weeks, if not months. It's going to cost tens of millions of dollars, probably upwards of 50 million to resolve, when had they just had the right tooling in place, the right commitment financially from the organization in that environment, maybe spent a tenth of that on proper tooling, education, resourcing up front, they wouldn't be in the situation they're in. But we see this time and time again. And it's like people just don't learn. Baltimore County School District, huge breach. Right? They weren't investing in cyber beforehand. Then they have this event, and not only do they have the cleanup and the impact to the students and teachers and community, now they've got to reinvest in tools. And the money's got to come from somewhere. It's unbudgeted, so they've got to pull it from other resources. And the whole thing is disruptive. But having this continual way of talking about cyber, getting it up to the board level where the board has that responsibility to ask, what are we doing about cyber? Are we doing enough? Do we have the right people in place? Are we having the right conversations? Let's hear from the cyber teams themselves. Let's not filter it through the reporting structure of, this person reports to this person reports to somebody else that, can't even spell cyber, and they're responsible for it, but they don't know what it is. Let's get the actual teams to the board level, having those conversations and presenting to the leadership of whatever the entity is, of where their true risk is. And I think, tools like we're talking about today can help with that from a continual perspective of looking at the organization as a whole, that hacker mentality. If we were in college or high school or even at the professional level playing another team, we're going to be watching game footage in that football scenario. We're going to be studying those other players, which is exactly what the threat actors are doing against all of our organizations. And especially in the public space, it's public information what tools they bought years ago because it's public funding. So all of those records are available. And it's just another one-up for the threat actors to be able to learn that environment and specifically focus on breaches that might impact the tools that environment's using. So it's just, just circling back, it is just frustrating that we get into this cycle of do nothing, breach, do everything, then do nothing, and then the cycle just repeats.
So how do these engagements look different from the civilian side of things, or what we see in the private or public sector versus what your experience is in the military? I'm really curious to hear how these red team engagements go down, and even if you could share what some of the goals are, or the takeaways, or even some of the particulars of those engagements, what those might look like in a Navy situation or a naval situation or a military situation?
No, that's a very interesting question, and the first thing that popped in my mind when you said that was there's a stark difference. One of the stark differences we noticed is we thought it was difficult to run red teaming exercises when we were in the military. We thought it was difficult getting people on board. We thought it was tough. And we had admirals commanding other admirals to do it. We had, forces of law, essentially, commanding people to do it in the real sense of that word, commanding people to do it. And it was still very tough. And you still had to get people together, and you had to have people have mutual empathy and understanding, and you had to do really tough things that people would just rather focus on other things. Boy, was it a lot even tougher when there was not a literal command from the commanding officer to do something. Now, there are organizations where the chief executives or the C-level or the board understand, perhaps implicitly, or perhaps before we got there, they understood this concept of why red teaming, as compared to other types of testing, but this adversarial approach to testing, why it is superior, and knew that that's what needed to be done, and people tended to fall in line and we could get things done. I found that when there was a lot of education needed in helping people understand, especially in a market where the concept of penetration testing is well understood and has its place, and is important, but where there are other options to find out what you think is wrong, it became even harder to suggest, well, what we really need to do is the pinnacle practice here, and that's red teaming. And